Well, I certainly appreciate the opportunity to be here tonight and to offer a few words about the North American model. I load up this slide with a few more pieces about me because as opposed to the scientific conversations that it seems you usually have on these monthly webinars, a little bit of my background's helpful and important in figuring out or I suppose how I come to the North American model. And where we'll be going this evening. I'm coming to you live from the headquarters of the Boone and Crockett Club in Missoula, Montana. Unfortunately, I don't have mahogany bookshelves in my home office, but I figured this would be a far more appropriate background given the role of the Boone and Crockett Club in both wild sheep conservation as well as in establishing and promoting the North American model of wildlife conservation nationwide. So in speaking about the model, there are wide ranging opinions of the model and views on what the model is, what it ought to be, and how it ought to be used. But at its very core, the model is an exercise that our community has taken upon itself several times over the course of our history in wildlife conservation. Many times we have taken the time to reflect, to see where we are today, to think thoughtfully about where we want to go into the future. And the North American model of wildlife conservation is one iteration of that. One of the first was the North American game policy, which was written by Aldo Leopold in the late 1930s. That North American wildlife policy was rewritten in the 1970s. Later on in the early 2000s, the American Wildlife Conservation Partners, or AWCP, put together or started establishing what they call the Wildlife for the 21st Century agenda for our community, the sporting hunting conservation community. There was a White House conference on hunting heritage. And all of these things sort of exist in the same space as the North American model. They vary in degrees of descriptiveness versus prescriptiveness. They vary in who their authorship was, who was brought around the table to convene these gatherings, to write these documents, to decide where the field ought to go moving forward. And the North American model of wildlife conservation is one iteration. I'll get into the story of how it came to be later, but first, let's lay out a couple definitions for what it is and what it is not. The first and most important thing is that the North American model of wildlife conservation, as it was established first in 2001, more formally in 2012, is reflective or descriptive of our field of wildlife conservation. It's not as prescriptive as some of those other aggregated agendas that have been put together by other coalitions and organizations. So I'm going to offer two definitions, one from each set of the progenitors of the model, the folks who wrote down its key principles. The first and is my favorite definition of the North American model comes from John Organ in a book written in 2018 on North American wildlife policy and law. That definition is fairly narrow. And it reads, the North American model of wildlife conservation is a set of principles that in their collective application distinguish wildlife conservation in the United States from other forms worldwide. Fairly narrow, couple key components, but we note that we have this set of principles, that they have to be applied together, and we're simply using it to say how the United States and Canada are different than the rest of the world and how they go about wildlife management. Shane Mahoney and Valerius Geist in 2019 gave a similar definition. The model is not an article of constitution. It's an evolved and shared system of conservation laws, principles, institutions, and policies that has enabled the successes of Canada and the United States in the recovery, management, and protection of wildlife and brought them global recognition. Again, the model is not, the first sentence there I think is, again, the most important to note. The model's not prescriptive, it's descriptive. The model is not codified anywhere. It is simply aggregated. So what's in it? The North American model of wildlife conservation has 7 key tenets that were distilled by Mahoney, Oregon, and Geist back in 2001, between 2001 and 2012. The first is that wildlife resources are held in public trust. That means that all of us own all of the wildlife. That differentiates us from Europe, where wildlife is owned by the landowner. In broad generalities, that's true in Europe and in other parts of the world. The second tenet is that markets for game are eliminated, specifically those unregulated markets that led to massive declines in iconic species. Think passenger pigeons, bison, and of course, wild bighorn sheep. The third tenet, allocation of wildlife, is by law. That means that we have rules and regulations set by our states, provinces, tribes, and at least occasionally the federal government about who can access wildlife and how they can access wildlife. Number 4 is a little more ethical. Wildlife may only be killed for a legitimate purpose. Generally speaking, that's embodied in the law, but it's also embodied in various ethical constructs, like the fair chase of the Boone and Crockett Club, and that which has been adopted by the Wild Sheep Foundation. Number 5, wildlife is considered an international resource. Frequently, this is most important for migratory species, thinking waterfowl, those species that make very long international migrations. The same can be said for locally migratory sheep, deer, elk, other ungulates that cross boundaries. And I've heard tell as well that international resource could also be could be thought of as interstate resource, right? We manage wildlife using state boundaries that are drawn by people and that wildlife don't frequently respect or know about. And wildlife has to be managed by all of the parties that have jurisdiction over those species. Number 6, science is the proper tool to discharge wildlife policy. That puts professional wildlife management at the forefront of the conversation, whether it be sheep or dabbling ducks. Scientists are the ones that ought to be, or that do rather, inform wildlife policy. And that the democracy of hunting, or the democracy of sport, is standard. That there are not major restrictions especially based on class, to who can and cannot buy hunting licenses, at least restrictions that are set by states, tribes, provinces. So where did this thing come from? Often when we talk about the North American model, 2 key narratives usually follow closely behind. And the first is of the recovery, or at least the start at recovery of iconic big game species. We start in thinking about the era of what Secretary of the Interior Stuart Udall called the era of big raids. We start in the latter half of the 19th century when, as I mentioned earlier, bison and passenger pigeons and deer and elk and moose and other wildlife species were being decimated by market hunting, and groups of folks, most notably at the time the Boone and Crockett Club, decided to work at the federal and then at the state level to recover those species. That movement of conservation policy and law started in Washington, D.C., moved outward towards the states, and we can see evidence of those early policies and law in the 7 tenets of the North American model. I think the best connection is probably the Lacey Act, which regulated the interstate trade of wildlife. That allocated wildlife by law. It most effectively considered wildlife an international resource, and it elevated the role of science in wildlife management. As we move forward in that history of wildlife restoration and conservation, we start to see the establishment of state and tribal and provincial wildlife agencies We see the elevation of the role of science in wildlife management decisions. We see the elimination of markets for game, or at least the start at regulating those markets. And so the real bedrock laws and policies, at least when it came to regulating wildlife, bigger environmental laws came later in the latter half of the 20th century. And there's debate over whether or not or how those are included in the North American model of wildlife conservation. Those are the bedrock laws that are represented here in the model. Now, that narrative continues through all the way to today. It tends to elevate the role of hunters in conservation, especially the conservation of game species. It doesn't specifically mention the role of funding, but it's integrally tied to the American system of conservation funding, by which hunters, anglers, and trappers buy licenses and buy equipment that's taxed to pay for state fish and wildlife agencies to conduct wildlife conservation research and management activities. That narrative carries us all the way through today, and that's frequently what organizations like the National Bighorn Sheep Education Center can continue to support. We talk about that narrative because it's the story of how several of these species were brought back, or at least the start at our efforts at recovery. Now, the other important story about the North American model of wildlife conservation is in the actual writing of the model. So three preeminent biologists and managers in our field, Valerius Geist, John Organ, and Shane Mahoney, in the late 1990s, early 2000s, started. They were challenged to write down what differentiated conservation in the United States and Canada from other forms around the rest of the world. And they started talking to people about the different laws and policies that underpin our fundamental institutions of wildlife management, that make up the bedrock of state fish and wildlife agencies. And what they ended up producing was the 7 tenets that we saw, along with a narrative of the recovery of those species, the narrative that I just walked us through. And it's important to keep those things in mind as we talk about the model, and hopefully we get into some more conversation here later about what the model is, and how we ought to use it. But it's important to recognize that that's how it came together. That's how they came up with it, where it's written down, and some of the most important questions about anything that we're looking at. So now we know what it is. We know how it was developed. Now, how do we use it? The North American model is, as it's been explained to me and as I understand it, is a model like a model airplane. It's a highly simplified version of very extensive volumes of laws, rules, regulations, policies, and case law. It allows us as students of wildlife conservation, as hunters, as anglers, as conservationists, to understand in a very distilled form the way in which we manage wildlife. It's frequently used as a proxy for actual or more tangible wildlife policy, including those case laws, statutes, regulations, policies, and practices. And it's often used as a foil when folks will have a critique of something in the field. And I'll talk about critiques here in a moment, but folks will have a critique of the model. But of course, having a critique of a model, just like a critique of a model airplane, is really about something deeper. It's about what's that model is representing. And so it allows us to bore into real challenges that we're facing as a field. And again, I'll remind the group that the North American model is retrospective. So it shows us where we have come from. It shows us our successes and our shortcomings. It allows us to the space and time to reflect on where we've come. But importantly, it doesn't tell us anything about where we're going. It doesn't say, it's not predictive. It doesn't tell us, this is within the North American model or this is without the North American model. It doesn't show us how to move forward when state fish and wildlife commissions are under attack from one side or the other. It doesn't show us how to be more relevant to broader constituencies. It doesn't necessarily say anything about funding or how we're going to pay for conservation. And I'm going to pause for just a second because I love the interpretation of, I'm assuming, quiet or silence, because it is silent on several things. It doesn't allow us to do as much as we could. And that's where we get into some more critiques of the model. And so this is the modern criticisms of the model have been rising since it was written down, really. And this is the focus of my graduate work at the University of Montana, was analyzing and categorizing critiques of the North American model. And what I found was that there are really three broad categories of critiques of the North American model of wildlife conservation. The first is that the model, as it's constructed, is missing critical components, that there is something amiss in those 7 core tenets that, when in aggregate, are used to differentiate wildlife conservation in the United States and Canada from other forms worldwide. In my opinion, those are perfectly reasonable. Sure, there are other things that we could or ought to add to the model, or at least think about. It's silent on habitat. It's silent on funding. It doesn't necessarily take a modern view of the role of markets in wildlife conservation. There are a whole bunch of gaps and vacancies, as they've been termed. The second category of critiques is that the narrative origin of the model is biased. And I mentioned those 2 narrative origins, the first being the long-term recovery of wildlife after broad, widespread decimation of game and non-game species alike. Folks will say that the narrative that is ascribed to the model that is told alongside the model elevates the role of hunters. Some would say overly emphasizes the role of hunters or other core demographics. Others would point to the second narrative origin of the model, that Mahoney, Geist, and Organ sat down and wrote it, that there's bias there. And like all of us, those 3 gentlemen have bias, and their role as trained biologists, their place in the field, their membership in certain organizations caused a bias in how the model was aggregated. And the third category of critiques, which I find to be most interesting, is that the North American model itself, as a construct, as something that exists, negatively affects the formulation or implementation of wildlife policy. That the North American model is held up as sacrosanct and does a disservice to those who seek to innovate in a field that desperately needs innovation. That it holds us back from going forward in ways that can serve different species, that engage different user groups, that it keeps us from doing the work that needs to be done to broaden our community. And there's, I think, a variety of different ways to go about thinking about that. And I think perhaps the best way to think about that sort of hardline box is to think about the story of bighorn sheep policy, which is what I hope everybody came here to talk about. I'm sure y'all have been thinking, man, this guy has been talking about the North American model for 25 minutes. When are we going to get to some sheep? Because that's what we enjoy. And sheep, broadly speaking, like other ungulates, fit into that narrative of recovery. However, it's a different story. Bighorn sheep, we know, were some of the most long-lasting species and some of the last to be extirpated merely because of where they live. They live in places that are hard to reach. They live in places that are hard to develop. unlike bison or passenger pigeons that were particularly vulnerable to market forces, bighorn sheep took a while to be extirpated, and then they took a while to start to be recovered. And we've yet to recover bighorn sheep across their range in the American West. And of course, when I say that, I mean north and south of the United States as well, the whole west of North America rather than the United States of America. And because of their unique situation and the fact that they aren't recovered fully yet, or to some historic range or baseline, that wherever we want to put that, we face different challenges with bighorn sheep policy and bighorn sheep conservation. Our obstacles to restoration are different, and they require different solutions. We're facing disease outbreaks, we're facing habitat use conversions, we're facing all sorts of different issues that are, aside from the conflicts that our field is dealing with when it comes to deer and elk, which by many measures, and by many folks, at least within our community, are causing issues due to overpopulation or overabundance. We see conflicts with landowners. We see conflicts between private lands and public lands. We see frequently too many critters in the quote unquote wrong place. But sheep are different. They are in desperate need of more collaborative conservation. They offer us both new challenges, but also new opportunities by which we can develop new mechanisms for conservation. That's, I think, one of the most interesting pieces of our conversation about the North American model, is that when critics levy that the model holds us back in certain ways from doing necessary conservation work, it forces me at least to look at species that need necessary conservation work still, that are not fully recovered, or that are still on the decline in some places due to a variety of factors. And I think it's worth our thoughtful consideration. So where do we go from here? We have this North American model that is underpinned by policies and law at the federal and state levels that aggregate the broad generalities about our institutions. We also have opportunities to set agendas outside of that model that are informed by that model, to do the good work of putting and keeping more wild sheep on the mountain. The Wild Sheep Foundation sets a 5-year horizon of policy priorities, all of which fit sort of within the North American model, but are a little more real and tangible. These are certainly prescriptive, unlike the model. And this is the work that we are doing as a firm and as a team and as a collective field every day to continue advancing the recovery of bighorn and thin-horn sheep. These goals include enhancing wild sheep habitat. We spend a lot of time with the Forest Service and the Bureau of Land Management working with those land managers to ensure that wild sheep have healthy places to live and necessary space. We work on restoring wild sheep to suitable habitat via translocation, or in ensuring that they're able to migrate freely. We work with the Department of Interior and Agriculture in Washington, D.C., as well as all of the Western Association of Fish and Wildlife Agencies. Chris, I caught you in an acronym, WAFWA. To ensure
Spell
that we're
please.
WAFWA, WAFWA.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you. And we work with all of those partners to put sheep back to where they used to be and where they belong, and to make sure that once they get there, they're able to thrive, hopefully absent from the threat of disease or from competitive invasive species like feral horses. We work to expand and protect wild sheep hunting opportunities. The most important example right now is in Southern California in the Castle Mountains area. In 2016, that 22,000 odd acres was declared a national monument, was transferred from the Bureau of Land Management to the National Park Service, and overnight hunters lost access to that area. We've been working for 7 years now to try to return hunting access to that land, and we understand that it's likely that sheep hunting may be available on that land if and when we're able to resume hunting there. We work to expand and protect wild sheep hunting opportunities. We raise awareness of wild sheep challenges, and we do that just like we are doing here tonight as a group. We're talking about the North American model of wildlife conservation. We're talking about sheep conservation, but we do this in the halls of Congress. We do this in the halls of state legislatures. We do this with state fish and wildlife agencies. We do this with tribal wildlife agencies. We spend time daily advocating for the challenges that are facing wild bighorn and thinhorn sheep across Western North America. And we try to do so strategically. We're always thinking on a 5, 10, 50-year horizon about how we can advance the mission of keeping and putting more wild sheep back on the mountain, and ensuring that we are able to provide opportunities to see and experience these denizens of the mountain for future generations. It's critical for us as the Wild Sheep Foundation. It's important for all of us who love to see and at least occasionally pursue wild sheep. And it's important because this is a tangible evolution of the North American model of wildlife conservation. This is real. This is active work that is going on to move forward beyond those critiques, to advance our field, and to go beyond the scale and scope of those 7 tenets. And I'll bring it back around to those 7 tenets to say that there are a handful of other ways that we can continue to evolve. It's become clear recently that the tenets of the model may evolve when the underlying policies and law evolve themselves, but not vice versa. It's been clear that the North American model shall not become prescriptive. But that doesn't mean that we can't look at some inconsistencies between modern agenda setting among the wildlife conservation community, whether it be the American Wildlife Conservation Partners, the White House Council on Hunting and Shooting Sports, the Secretary of Interior's Federal Advisory Council on Hunting and Wildlife Conservation, that we ought to compare those things to the North American model, compare those policies to where we have come from, and help that and use that to inform where we are going in the future. And we see a handful of inconsistencies, and I'll just raise 3 of them, and then we'll open it up to a discussion. So the first inconsistency that we see is that markets is on the second tenet of the model, that markets for game are eliminated. We know that there are several markets for wildlife that exist, that are highly regulated, and that have been successful in promoting the recovery of species, the American alligator being one of the most successful. Fur bearers across the United States and Canada are part of a marketplace system, and recovery of species like beaver and muskrat have been quite successful. There are policies on the cutting edge of markets that may not relate to game species, but certainly relate to wildlife. I'm thinking most coherently about the United States Fish and Wildlife Service's rulemaking efforts to establish conservation banking for endangered species. It's a market-based approach to recovering species like the American burying beetle, sage grouse, lesser prairie chickens. And there's, in my view, nothing wrong with getting more help when we always need more help to do the good work of conservation. And we shouldn't be held back by a tenet of the model. so long as our activity or our mission is advancing us in a collective and common way. Another inconsistency that I've identified, or that we've been discussing among the field, is an inconsistency or mutual exclusivity between the third and the sixth tenets of the model, and we're really splitting hairs here. The third tenet states that allocation of wildlife is by law, and the sixth states that science is the proper tool by which to discharge wildlife policy. And many of us who work in the field, and many who keep an eye on policy and politics, know that frequently law and science, democracy and science, are at odds, that they are frequently in flux and exist on a spectrum of use and incorporation as we make wildlife policies and law. Science in itself cannot tell a state Fish and Wildlife Commission what to do. It can inform different potential results of various management actions, but it at its core cannot say, tags up, tags down, only full curl rams. We have to imbue those decisions with values and attitudes and ensure that those are made in the same way that by which we make laws, through the democratic process, or through a variety of democratic processes. And the last inconsistency that we see pretty frequently is that the democracy of hunting is standard. And while that's frequently true, that states, tribes, provinces don't set out major barriers that keep folks from getting a hunting license, we know that the democracy of access has been a contentious issue, and is not a reality for most hunters, be it in the West, in the East, in the South, or in the North. And so true democracy of hunting isn't necessarily standard if access to those species, access to that wildlife is not standardized. And there are a variety of reasons and non-reasons by which we ought to move those processes in a more democratic direction, that we should be trying to increase access for hunting, that we should be trying to increase revenue for conservation. All of those things exist in flux. All of those things are political decisions. And while it's important to look back on what the model says, while it can be helpful to know where we've come from, or at least have a hard look at how a few folks have described the current institution that we have, it's not fully set up, or I should say this model isn't fleshed out enough, nor is it prescriptive in how to deal with the challenges that we're facing today. And those challenges are up to us as hunters, as wildlife advocates, as conservationists, to work on solving. And we ought to make sure that we are using the model appropriately in doing so, that we're using it as a touchstone, but also not letting it hold us back from doing the necessary work of innovating and iterating and furthering our field of wildlife conservation. And so with that, I'm more than happy to answer questions about the North American model. I'd love to answer questions about wildlife policy and law and modern sheep policy. I see some friends have joined us, and I'm very glad to see Larry and Kate on here. With that, Sarah, I'll turn it right back over to you and let you moderate or ask the first question if you'd like it.
Yeah, thank you, Charlie. This was extremely informative. Great presentation. I'll pass it to the audience first. Anybody in the audience with a question for Charlie? Carolyn, I think you're on mute, so you may need to unmute yourself.
Please.
Charlie, I'm not even sure how to formulate this question, but I wonder if you could just reflect on where trapping has been and where it's going as a piece of this conversation.
Well, it's certainly a piece of this conversation. trappers are a part of the American system of conservation funding, but we certainly know that social license for trapping is on the decline. I often think about these kinds of questions in terms of social license and legal license, right? And a social license is essentially your approval rating to do something, where your legal license is what you can buy from Game and Fish. And so, if you have, if you trapping's tough because social license is low across the board. Let's say if you harvest an elk with a copper bullet using fair chase principles, and you're going to use that elk to feed your family, and you have all the proper license, you've got really high acceptance rate, you have a high social license, and you also have your legal license. Whereas if you trap a grizzly bear without any paperwork and you're doing it illegally, and you don't eat the meat, then you let it lie, and all of these things, you have really low social licensure and really low legal licensure. You don't have a legal license. And what we often see is there's a lag between social license and legal license. And eventually, in our system of democratic processes, the social license or the legal license catches up with the social license. And sometimes that's for the better, sometimes it's for the worse. I see that as at least partially as a tool to explain what we're seeing with trapping across the country. And I always have to give a plug to whether it's trapping or hunting in more controversial spaces, that we are seeing attacks on those forms of consumptive use, but we're also seeing outgrowths in several places that are in my view important to celebrate. Michigan expanded the take of bobcat. Missouri had its first legal bear hunt regulated by the Missouri Department of Conservation, a department that's been around since the 1930s, at their first issuance of bear tags. Those are great conservation success stories that are being implemented in my view, smart ways by very smart people. And we should hold those examples up and celebrate them as much as we decry attacks on other forms of consumptive use. That answer your question, Carolyn?
Yeah, I think it's just a huge topic. And, in looking at all the things that you've just presented, I just didn't understand quite where it landed. So that is helpful. And it's still a bit fuzzy for me, frankly.
Absolutely. And Pat, that gets to your question that you just dropped in the chat about legitimate purpose and who gets to decide what a legitimate purpose for killing wildlife is. Really the only person who gets to decide, or the only institution that gets to decide is the state agency or commission or legislature that decides what can and can't be done. But of course, we all have space to influence those bodies, and we have a great privilege of being able to influence or be elected to or appointed to those bodies, and that's where those decisions are going to continue to be made. So
Thanks for the question, Pat. And Charlie, maybe you could shed some light here on a definition of trophy hunting. And can you tell our constituents here, can you give us some definition or some broader context around the North American model and trophy hunting?
The model is largely silent on the word trophy does not appear in the model, of course, and it's up to interpretation how that sort of form of hunting, form of pursuit fits into the whole picture. There's so much debate in our field over the use of the word trophy and whether or not it ought to be even part of our diction around hunting. The state of Wyoming and the Wyoming Wildlife Federation, the folks who are on the call can probably answer that question better than I can, though I won't put Jess on the spot to talk about how the state of Wyoming defines trophy wildlife. In my view, there's distinction to be had between a trophy, a reminder of an experience that's in the eye of the beholder, and a form of selective harvest that aims to that's done by a person who aims to pursue and harvest a mature specimen of a species in their own view. I think ongoing conversation about trophy hunting, like we were talking, or like I was mentioning about social licensure for anything called trophy hunting is extremely low, in the ballpark of, and that we're about to get a new survey result from the Fish and Wildlife Service on the attitudes of Americans towards hunting, fishing, and trapping. That's in print. I was teased with an advanced copy the other day and was not able to get the numbers that I wanted to out of it. But I understand that from the latest version, which I believe was 2018, trophy approval of so-called trophy hunting was somewhere in the range of 14% of Americans highly approving or approving. When you look at that same highly approving or approving figure for hunting for food, we're in the range of 80% approval. And that, like I was saying, social license will continue to drive legal license when it comes to species, and those that can be hunted or are commonly quote unquote trophy hunted. It's yet to be seen what that will mean.
Hi, Jess. Thanks for joining us tonight. Looks like you unmuted, so I'd love to invite you to participate in responding to that prompt. Jess, I would love if you could introduce yourself. We're really grateful to have you with us.
Yeah, I'm Jess Johnson. I'm the Government Affairs Director for the Wyoming Wildlife Federation. And I'm really excited to be on here. I actually got on here because a very good friend of mine, Lorna, who is a gamekeeper over in Scotland, is sitting next to me. So it's been really interesting discussion throughout the night between the North American model and Scottish model of conservation. But to answer the trophy hunting thing, within the state of Wyoming, you know, if you were to like within statute and law, trophy hunting is defined as the hunting of bears, lions, and wolves in a certain part of the state of Wyoming. As you know, wolves have two designations within the state. Part of them, sort of the larger buffer around the greater Yellowstone area, is a trophy zone for wolves. And outside of that, they're considered predators. That's a whole other webinar. So the definition within law is as trophy game is categorized as bears, lions, and in parts of the state, wolves. Part of the things that go hand in hand with that trophy designation is there is no need to remove edible portions from the field. So the only legal requirement with upon harvesting trophy game is to take head and hide. This is something that, going back to how Charlie talks about social licensure, is really a problem within Wyoming state law, especially in the opinion of Wyoming Wildlife Federation. And looking at how social licensure pushes on to statute and how we change our laws within you know, legislation. Part of what we're working towards is changing the name of trophy hunting, asking them to call them large carnivores, so we don't saddle these animals with a already contentious word. As he said, there's very many definitions of it. It depends on who you're talking to on what trophy is. It's a problematic word, so we're just trying to leave it out of statute altogether, as well as rope in the stipulation of removing edible portions from the field should you harvest any of these large carnivores. Part of that is you know, a much deeper sort of like look at how we deal with the ethics and fair chase of hunting around carnivores. But a lot of this is just, you know, good sense and being able to get back to the actual scientific discussion of wildlife policy that often gets pulled into emotional discussion when you use the word trophy. And yeah, so that's sort of the basis of what trophy hunting is in the state of Wyoming. We'd love to see it change. There was a set of bills this year in the 2023 legislature that didn't go anywhere because of how busy they were. They'll be coming back this next year and every subsequent year until we get them passed. But yeah, so thank you for a little bit of time. And this was a really great discussion of the North American model. I do think the science discussion is a real one. Because it's while it's driven by science, we also know that political science and social science play a large part in policy.
Thank you, Jess.
Thanks, Jess. And that the trophy discussion, especially in Wyoming, is a great example of digging deeper on real and tangible laws and policies beyond the scope of the North American model. That's sort of a theoryist, concept. That language in Wyoming statute, in my opinion, ought to change so that it's interpreted as an adequate regulatory mechanism by the Fish and Wildlife Service, so that some of those species can be more durably delisted from the Endangered Species Act. There's a complicated interaction here that looks a lot more like the inside of a Boeing than that Delta model that I put up, that we have to dig into.
Other questions from the audience? Jake?
Yes, thank you. So I got it's a first part's maybe a little bit of a comparison, and then partly going back to the, I guess, critiques part of the model, but then also where we're going in the future. And I missed the first part of the presentation, so this might have been covered briefly, but I've worked extensively in parts of Africa. And as is well known, the African model of conservation is 200 times different than the North American model of conservation, but it has been successful. And especially in South Africa, which every method of conservation they do over there is starkly against what we do. Principally the privatization of wildlife over there. But it works. And in most parts of Africa, the wildlife is either owned by the private landowner or the government. It's never owned by the public. When I say owned by the government, it is the government's resource to do with what they want. And that varies between the countries. But again, they've got lots of wildlife, very, robust, environments over there. But the reason it works is because that is the model that will work with their culture, their socioeconomic conditions, their values, etc. Ours works because I think they were developed with our cultural conditions at the time, our society, our values, etc. But now, obviously, we're in the midst of this giant societal change in America. Our values are changing across the board. I mean, we've just been talking about social license. I mean, social license for trophy hunting 30 years ago was way higher back then than it is now. So there's a value there, change there. Our culture is changing. Our socioeconomic condition is changing. So say in the next 40 years, 30, 40 years, will we have a society, will we have values and a culture that is no longer compatible with the North American model of conservation?
I think we're already seeing an evolution of the underlying laws, policies, and procedures of the North American model towards a future that's deemed more desirable by those who are elected and appointed to create that future. We're already seeing all sorts of changes, and I would say all sorts of policy hiccups towards towards a future that differentiates or deviates from the North American model of wildlife conservation. And I think the sort of elegant thing about the model is that it's just descriptive of where we've come from. And so we can talk about positives and negatives of moving away from the model. And I believe there are both positives and negatives to moving forward in a direction that we all agree to move forward on, not being too restricted by, but still respecting where we've come from. I would also say that there are lessons to be learned from systems of conservation that are employed in other parts of the world where different challenges are being faced. Different parts of Eastern and Southern Africa that face issues with human wildlife conflict that are in some ways similar, in other ways extremely dissimilar from those that we face here in the Western United States. There are policies and procedures in Scotland that could be employed in the United States where perhaps overabundance of certain species are causing issues. I think the most important thing for me is that we continue to work in policy arenas, and I would say perhaps most importantly at state wildlife commissions, to ensure that we're creating a policy ecosystem for wildlife that we all that will serve us better than the system that we have today.
I would add on to that only that for those of you that are interested and looking to go forward and talk about some of this, that only happens when interested citizens communicate, whether it's with their game commissions or it's their state legislators or their national decision makers. And there's a significant lack of people doing that in all the states. For who is hunting in the states, very few of them are speaking up at the legislative and commission level as these changes are evolving and as these hiccups that we're finding are happening. And so just as another fellow lobbyist, showing up and being there is important. And it does help dictate, and especially in Wyoming, your voice is it's a heavy voice here because we have so few people. And oftentimes your legislators and your commission members are your neighbors.
Thanks, Jess. I so appreciate that. And I just dropped in the chat a link to an article I put together for the Meat Eater folks a while back about how to talk to politicians about conservation issues. And hopefully that'll lend a little advice, a few words of wisdom on how to get started. Because we so often hear, call your legislator. All right, I've got their phone number. Now, what do I say? What am I asking them to do? Do they even know what I'm going to be talking about? And happy to talk more about that, but hope you all enjoy that as a tool, or at least a little thought exercise on next time you're looking to get engaged.
Thank you, Charlie. That's helpful. One question I have that it's more of a prompt, so you can speak to a question that I face and my colleagues face at the National Bighorn Sheep Center. So in your presentation, you mentioned once the term consumptive use model of wildlife conservation, and you also did in your Q&A. So can you talk about what that means in relation to how wildlife is typically managed in other nations across the globe that don't use a consumptive use model, and how are outcomes different?
So there's quite a bit of breadth to that. I think the most unique piece of the integration of consumptive users in the United States is the fact that hunters, anglers, trappers, and quite notably recreational shooters pay for a huge proportion of dedicated revenue for state fish and wildlife agencies. And for those who unfamiliar or haven't heard about the American system of conservation funding, it's a little different than the North American model. Folks will say that it was left out of the model because Canada has a slightly different funding model. I agree with that, as does Mexico, as does several other countries. What we have in the United States is a system by which hunters, anglers, and trappers buy licenses from their states, tribes, or provinces. That money is then matched by federal grants that are funded by excise taxes on archery equipment and tackle, firearms and ammunition, as well as fishing equipment and marine fuel. Those three sources, so hunting, fishing, and trapping licenses, Pittman-Robertson funds, which are excise taxes collected on firearms, ammunition, archery tackle, and then Dingell-Johnson dollars, which is the equivalent for fisheries, make up 69% of the average state Fish and Wildlife Agency's dedicated revenue on an annual basis. It's a huge proportion that consumptive users are paying into to continue the conservation and management work of these agencies. And I think perhaps the most important piece is that we have robust institutions for management and conservation that are pretty intimately connected to consumptive users. There are all sorts of other mechanisms that work when wildlife is, as Jake was saying earlier, is either owned by the government, is owned by a crown, is owned by a private landowner. Those systems are different, and sometimes they produce better results, more desirable results for some people, sometimes less desirable results for others. Totally case by case basis, but that hopefully provides a good framework for thinking about that issue and some background of how tightly wound our system is here.
Thank you for sharing. I think that piece is really helpful for our audience today and for future individuals who watch this recording. Before we close it up, were there any other questions from the audience, from the chat? Well, thank you, Charlie. I'm so impressed by the extent of knowledge you have around this topic and conservation in the United States. I think that the fact that you are in the Boone and Crockett office, it really adds a layer of meaning and history around this very complex topic that by no means can even be dipped into for 1 hour. But I commend you for joining us tonight and sharing an overview to get us started. I want folks on the line to be reminded that all of our webinars are recorded and available on our website under Programs Wild Sheep Webinar Series. Our next webinar will be in August, which would be a presentation for our summer with our summer intern who is studying wildlife biology with the University of Wyoming. Charlie, I look forward to meeting you at future wild sheep events and working for the cause. And just to tie it all together, Charlie, and to have Jess on the line today, I think that we at the National Bighorn Sheep Center are really eager to help educate both locals and visitors alike around these complex issues so that they can be informed voters and inform individuals to help speak to politicians around really important conservation issues. So once again, thank you. And we look forward to being partners with you in this cause.
Thanks very much. I'll appreciate it.
Thanks, everyone. Have a wonderful evening. Bye, Kate. Good to see you. Thank you, Chris. Chris, Carolyn is a board president. She jumped off, but.
Did you want to stop the recording?
Yes. Let's see, hold on 1 second here.